In his highly influential book, The Production of Space, published in English in 1991, Henri Lefebvre sets out his much-cited conceptual triad of space, as he called it. He first refers to spatial practice. This he sees as, quote, embracing the spheres of production and reproduction and the particular locations and spatial sets characteristic of each social formation. The second are what he calls the representations of space, in which he includes conceptualized space, the space of scientists, planners, urbanists, technocrats, and social engineers. Finally, he writes of representational spaces. This is space, quote, as directly lived through its associated images and symbols. It's what we might call everyday space, the space of inhabitants and users, but also of a few writers and philosophers who describe and aspire to do no more than describe. And it's this third aspect of lived space that I want to explore here today. Space is an entity that brings society, culture, and power together. Built space in particular, and architecture, also carries with it deeply cultural, social, and personal meanings, as well as memories. These are issues which are at the heart of social and spatial theory, the sociology of urban culture, cultural studies, and questions of social and cultural identity. And these are the things and ideas in which I'm interested. So taking a cue from Lefebvre then, and drawing on my own lived experience, and not least the faculty of memory, what I want to do this evening is to explore how, as scholars and practitioners, our work, by which I mean our research, our writing, and our teaching, how it's influenced and moulded, indeed often generated and even determined by very specific spaces, places, and relationships which are, of course, unique to every single one of us. It is, for example, most obviously influenced by the place that is the city and the country where we live, and the kind of institution where we work. In my own case, over the last few decades, this has been Delhi, the capital of India, London, the capital of the UK, and Binghamton, New York, which is not quite the capital of the United States, nor even Manhattan, but rather a kind of displaced suburb of New York City. I'll come back to that later on. Within that institution, the nature of which is also influenced by the city and the state, what we do is also influenced by the departments and the disciplines to which we belong. That is, I'm talking as if we are kind of academics here. In my own case, this is humanities and social sciences in Delhi, sociology, building and architecture in London, and art history and sociology in Binghamton, New York. Also important are the kinds of people who become our students and the places, social backgrounds, and countries from which they come. Our research and writing are also influenced by the social networks to which we belong, by the country where we were raised, and the languages, even the accents, we speak. In my case, post-imperial Britain and English in its various forms, including Indian English or American English, even Lancashire English. And of course, it's also influenced by the historically interesting times in which we all live. Above all, as sociologist John Urry has shown, our research and writing is also influenced by mobilities, the mobilities of peoples, things, information, and ideas. So what I want to say about these different spaces and the relationships that help determine what we do as scholars, all this touches on the sociology, the geography and the history of knowledge, provided of course that this also includes the accidents, the serendipities and the unforeseen happenings that are equally important in shaping our everyday lives. So what I'm going to provide today is less an academic lecture with lots of theoretical references, but rather a series of personal reflections, which if we wish, we can also use to help examine our own history of Lefebvre's lived space. So what I'm saying is that what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to recommend all of you individually to go home and do yourself. In the second half of the 1960s, I had the privilege of being head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. The IIT was a new elite higher education institution producing engineering graduates essential for India's development agenda. It was one of 5 such institutions supported by development assistance from the world's leading industrial states, the USA, the USSR as then was, Germany, the UK and UNESCO. Each year the 5 IITs admitted the top 1,500 students from a competitive all-India entrance exam that was taken by something like 80,000 students, applicants. At Delhi IIT, humanities and social science courses in English studies, economics, politics, sociology, visual design, management, they all formed part of the overall curriculum. So for me, it was to provide a major schooling in interdisciplinarity. Living and working in India for 5 years had an absolutely enormous influence on me and also on my wife, I should add. It was by far the most important educational experience of our lives. While time doesn't permit me to elaborate on this, I'll mention just 2 items relevant to my focus here on culture, space and power and its representation in the urban. The first was the sheer physical and spatial experience of living, walking and driving about in Delhi for 5 years. As I subsequently described in my book on colonial urban development, published in 1976, India's New Delhi was for me a classic example of the modern colonial city. On one hand, Old Delhi, an old-time walled city built by the Mughal emperor in the 1630s with a massive fort and an enormous mosque bursting with commercial activity, people living at densities of 600 or more per square mile, an enormous cultural variety of colour, ethnicity, dress, splendid smell, taste and architecture, religion, sounds, movement, penetrated by streams of poverty. Nearby, though some distance away, the new imperial capital of New Delhi, a massive expanse of colonial space built by the British in the early 20th century. Vast monuments and huge symbolic European-style buildings, grandiose viceregal palace, Parliament building and secretariat, broad tree-lined boulevards, at that time with little traffic. It's a bit different today if you go to Delhi. Long avenues and vistas, sprawling bungalows in spacious 3 or 4 hectare compounds. It was the most spectacular demonstration of the spaces of cultural and political power, of segregated ruler and ruled, of an imperial modern city and a colonized traditional one. It was this, the visual, psychic and material experience of colonial space, simultaneously political and cultural, that hit me straight between the eyes. It was this that not only determined my research at the time, but also for many years to follow. The first paper I wrote on the topic was called Colonial Urbanisation, a cross-cultural inquiry into the social use of space. The language here reflecting some of the contemporary writings of anthropologists Edward T. Hall on space, as what he called space as the hidden dimension, and Amos Rappaport on the cultural aspects of housing and urban form, a book that everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with. Equally influential were the writings of American sociologist John Useem on the notion of the third culture, many years before Homi Bhabha had come up with a very similar concept. The subtitle of my book on colonial urban development was Culture, Social Power and Environment, that accurately reflected the key analytical concepts that were influential for me at that time. Equally, however, if not more important, were the geopolitical factors of colonialism and colonial power which framed the production of space, something which Lefebvre doesn't really address. It was impossible to understand the colony without simultaneously taking note of the metropole, the imperial centre. Indeed, not just the metropole, but the entire imperial and colonial urban system, where one colonial city was only a complementary part of the larger whole. In his highly influential book, The Urban Question, in 1972, urban sociologist Manuel Castells suggested that we should look at third world cities through the theoretical lens of what he called dependent development. That is to say, urbanization in developing countries, what we now refer to as the global south, I guess, that urbanization did not arise from industrialization in those places, but was dependent on industrialization in the core, to use Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems perspective. Indeed, the invention of the concept of the three worlds in the early 1950s, especially the first world and the third world, and the unhistorical discourse that accompanied it, prevented for over 3 decades the recognition of the essential connections and interdependence between them. Long before sociologists such as Roland Robertson started writing about the idea of globalization in the middle 1980s, or Immanuel Wallerstein, the notion of the world system, a decade before that, the territories of the world had for 600 years been interlinked and managed through a succession of global empires. This is the theme of John Darwin's book that's called After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires Between 1400 and 2000. Imperial cities, by which I mean the capitals of empires, like London or Beijing, for example, have often been the forerunners of what in the last 20 years we've learnt to call world cities. The significance of imperialism in establishing the infrastructures for globalization and the creation of world cities has been belatedly recognized in the recent Handbook of Globalization and World Cities, published last month, and I'm very happy to acknowledge the presence of Peter Taylor here, who is one of the, if not the chief editor of that excellent book. However, by far the 3 most important things I learned from our 5-year stay in Delhi was the significance of something called culture. And second important thing was the exercise of colonial power, including the importance of imperial and global interconnectivity. And third, a commitment to interdisciplinarity. So that's my first city. Let me say a word now about London, or a few words. From the early 1970s to 1987, I worked in London, first at Brunel University and subsequently at the Architectural Association and University College Development Planning Unit. There are at least three unique things about Brunel University. First, like the Humboldt University in Berlin, it was the first in Britain to be named after a famous individual rather than a county or a city, which means, of course, that no one outside Britain knows where it is. Secondly, it's the closest university to Heathrow Airport, which means it's the earliest from which to fly out the country, the easiest from which to fly out the country. And third, it's on the very last stop of the Piccadilly Underground line and an hour from King's Cross Station. Why am I telling you this? Because from King's Cross, every week during term for 13 years, I caught the train back to Leeds, 200 miles away, where my wife, who worked at Leeds University, and our 4 children lived. At Brunel, I first taught urban sociology in the master's program, graduate MA program, and then developed a 4-year sociology and environmental studies course for a new degree in building, the aim of which was to link up the otherwise empty professional space between architecture and construction management. So having one foot in sociology and the other in building was part of the reason why, after a few years, my second edited book came to be called Buildings and Society, Essays on the Social Development of the Built Environment, which I'm happy to say is still in print. The book was based on 2 questions. What can we understand about a society by examining its buildings and physical environment? And secondly, what can we understand about buildings and environments by examining the society in which they exist? My own chapter in this edited book was titled A Space for Time and a Time for Space, the Social Production of the Vacation House. What I was interested in here were the changes in the social organization of space and time following Europe's industrialization and social transformation, and the way these changes were represented in the emergence of new building types. How have different social and spatial types of buildings like the prison, the hospital, a factory, office, laboratory, school, etc., how have they evolved in different cultural and social formations over time, and under what different distributions of political power? This was in 1980 and just before Michel Foucault's work began to appear in Britain. These 2 questions had come out of a study of one particular building type in Britain, a building type initially produced for a very particular social class and gender, i.e. the upper middle class gentleman. Also out of a particular geocultural location, the countryside, and also from a specific unit of time, the weekend, that had emerged during the industrial reorganization of work and leisure. I've forgotten the exact first reference to the term work end. I think it was in 1881 or 1882, the first identified reference to something called the weekend. These were processes of change that had resulted in the appearance in the late 19th century of a hitherto unknown dwelling type, the gentleman's countryside weekend bungalow. Now, I'd begun this research on the history of the bungalow, a word and a building form that had originated, of course, in India. That's the original Bengal hut from which the name Bangala comes, first made reference to in the middle of the 18th century. This is its adaptation, of course, by the British. And this is its transference to into Britain. When I discovered that a building form called a bungalow could be found in every continent in the world, from Asia to Australia to Africa to North and South America, and in virtually every language, the study became more serious. Hence the subtitle, The Bungalow, the Production of a Global Culture, that was published in 1985. This was the first time, as far as I know, that this phrase, global culture, had been used in the title of a book. It was this that first got me interested in globalization, though that word only entered into the discourse of sociology and the social sciences in the following year, 1985, in an article by sociologist Roland Robertson. As I've mentioned, for 13 years I commuted by train the 200 miles between Leeds and London. The 3 to 4 hour journey somehow welded the cities together. It not only provided a great opportunity for grading students' papers, it was a wonderful way of studying the urban landscape. First the suburbs, in and then out of London, and then the spatial profile of city centres, the way that different building types, banks, offices, churches, malls, were distributed around the city, and particularly how the bungalow, as a very distinctive and recognizable kind of one-story dwelling, marked the distinction between the urban and the suburban and the rural. This is called Bungalows from the Train. We derive our identities from many sources: the experience and memories of the cities where we live, the kind of work we do, our families, friends and social networks. In my case, though we lived in Leeds, I didn't work there, and so I never really identified with the city. Instead, I identified with London, where I worked, had my friends and colleagues. I also identified with what used to be called British Rail, which over 13 years provided me with a mobile office and the space in which I stitched together my different interests and identities in sociology, cultural studies, imperialism, colonialism, development planning and building an urban form, packing them into my briefcase as I got out of the train in Leeds. Moreover, tracing the history of the bungalow from one country and continent to another, India, Southeast Asia, Britain, United States, Canada, the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, Australia, sparked my interest in ways of looking at what Roland Robertson, in his felicitous and original phrase, has called the world as a single place, and thinking out theoretical frameworks of how to do this. When, therefore, at a conference in Mexico City in the early 1980s, I was invited by John Friedman, then head of urban and regional planning at UCLA, to work on London as a case study in the development of his now globally familiar world city hypothesis. Not only was I excited at the prospect, but every newspaper I picked up on the tube as I travelled across London seemed relevant to the project. This was during the 80s and before the so-called Big Bang in the city. London, rapidly succeeding New York as the world's financial centre, was exploding in every direction, not least in its postmodern architecture. Yet Brunel, ideal for thinking about the sociology of building form, did not, despite its proximity to the bustling global hub of Heathrow, it didn't offer the kind of international atmosphere for thinking about London as a world city. To begin with, the students in my classes were solidly British, or indeed less British than actually English. I didn't have a group of international students there with whom I could explore more global ideas. For this, however, teaching at the Development Planning Unit at University College London and then on the International Housing course at the AA was far better. Students came from all over the world, and they not only provided a more culturally diverse and challenging context, but also prompted some pre-theoretical ideas about globalization. And for research, It couldn't have been anything better than the old British Library that was just round the corner. I should, of course, add a brief footnote here. We all know how essential, despite the internet, good libraries are. Living in Leeds had one very major advantage during these years, because half an hour's drive up the road was the British Library's interlibrary loan division. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but there it was, located with the cows in the middle of the fields near Boston Spa, with its 4 million items and virtually empty reading room that I used to go in, maybe one other person using it. It was an absolute researcher's paradise. The highly influential paper by John Friedman and Gertz Wolff on World Cities in Formation, an Agenda for Research and Action, was published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research in 1982. In it, they spelt out what they called, quote, the spatial articulations of the emerging world system of production and markets through a global network of cities. This and the later paper on the world city hypothesis were to have an enormous and still continuing influence. According to Google Scholar, they have been cited over 2,500 times. They not only gave a global direction to urban research, but also influenced the strategic development policies of major world cities. City officials and scholars around the world started asking, is my city a world city? Or if not, how can we make it one? Or even, as in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, building one absolutely from scratch. In the last 30 years, as we all know, there's been a veritable flood of research published on the phenomenon of world cities. Somebody called them the cottopins of the world economy. And most recently, the book that I mentioned earlier, Handbook of Globalization and World Cities, that came out last month, which is edited by Ben de Rudder and 2 other people, and Peter Taylor in the audience here. Much of the research today focuses on things like networks, capital flows, mega events, architecture, banking, real estate, on which the economy of contemporary world cities like London, New York, Singapore, Mumbai depends. The financial crisis triggered by the collapse of Lehman Brothers in New York in September 2008 revealed that the City of London accounted for 1/5 of Britain's national income. As we're also aware, since this crisis, thousands of jobs in the financial sector and related sectors have just melted away. The dominant picture that has emerged from this research is that the world city is somehow a new phenomenon, something invented, as perhaps I've hinted, by John Friedman in the 1980s, or indeed in its global city form by Saskia Sassen. Yet as I've argued in various places, 2/3 of the 130 or so existing or emerging world cities, defined by the experts on the basis of their advanced producer services, you know, finance, law, insurance, real estate, advertising, etc., are either ex-imperial capitals or one-time colonial cities. It's often forgotten that as recently as 100 years ago, when both my parents were still alive, I mean, for me, that's not very long ago, that world space was divided into some 16 major empires, mainly, though not only European, administered and governed from long-established imperial or prominent colonial cities. It was these which laid down the infrastructural foundations of the contemporary world cities, from language to law, railroads to banks, education to city plans, and not least the culturally cosmopolitan populations. Only if we recognize this can we understand why there are 12,000 Indian, actually usually Bangladeshi and more particularly Sileti restaurants in Britain, or that 50% of New York cabbies, you know, driving yellow cabs of course, are from South Asia, you know, because of course they all speak English. This is why 20 years ago the subtitle of my book on global cities, published in 1990 and the outcome of John Friedman's invitation, was Post-Imperialism and the Internationalization of London. What I was trying to do was to highlight the historical imperial and post-colonial continuity in the emergence of most world and global cities. Today, London's demography, with over 1 in 3 people born abroad and 300 languages spoken in its schools, has become more genuinely multicultural and global. It was, however, these 15 years of working in London that further opened up, in a very empirical way, my interest in global cities and globalization. I mean, what I'm saying here, just to underline it once again, is if I hadn't been doing all this commuting up and down and you know, just working in London, I would have never have kind of got into this. Anyway, my final example of how the cities, the institutions, the departments, the disciplines that we work in influence the kind of research and teaching we do is that of, if not quite Manhattan, as I've mentioned, it's the distant New York suburb of Binghamton. Very good Scotch, that. Binghamton in upstate New York is about 190 odd miles from Times Square and is the home of one of the 4 PhD granting campuses of the State University of New York. The State University has some 468,000 students spread around 64 campuses in a state the size of England. According to its website, it's the largest university system in the world. Binghamton itself is a small city, but a big suburb, of less than 50,000 inhabitants, but the large majority of the undergraduate population come, with their cars, from the Big Apple, just 3 hours' drive away. For me, the attraction of working there was twofold. To begin with, Binghamton University was and is the home of the Fernand Braudel Center for the Study of Economies, Historical Systems and Civilizations. In 1988, this was under the direction of a distinguished professor of sociology, Emanuel Wallerstein, whose book on the modern world system, 1974, had caught my attention some years before. Here was a way of looking at the world beyond the boundaries of the state. Was this the kind of global theoretical framework for understanding the different aspects of global cities and colonial urbanism that I'd been looking for since coming back from India in 1970? The second attraction was the research and teaching field which the art history department had advertised in relation to the position which I eventually took there as professor of art history and of sociology. And what the theme was industrialization, colonialism, and the development of national cultures. My appointment was to help establish a new graduate program, teaching, promoting research, and recruiting students around this theme of colonialism and national cultures. As I've written elsewhere, I didn't expect to confront colonialism quite so quickly or so directly. Let me cite a little from what I wrote in my last book. Taking up the new position, I was struck not just by the challenges of developing courses and research on colonialism, industrialization, and the development of national cultures, but what seemed to be the colonial landscape itself. Near the campus was an optician's, Empire Vision. Across the road, colonial budget rooms were being let. A sign over the clothing section in the university bookstore announced the Colonial Shop. Travelling around the region, I found a colonial hair design salon, a colonial real estate, colonial pizza, and quite a number of colonial hotels. The only traces of the original indigenous Native Americans, Cherokee inhabitants, were in the names of the 2 rivers, the Susquehanna and the Shenango, around which the city of Binghamton had been built. I should just say that Binghamton is named after a William Bingham, and as I've written in my book, William Bingham is buried in Bath Abbey, another interesting colonial connection. Less than 1% of the street names commemorated the names of the indigenous people who, prior to their removal, maybe 18th century ethnic cleansing, had inhabited the area: the Mohawk, the Genesee, the Otsoningo, the Oneanta, Nanticoke, and others. The main exception to this was a profiled image of a caricatured Native American placed at intervals along the expressway running through the state, and then the occasional kitsch tourist souvenir that you could see in shops. The association worldwide of European colonialism, mainly but not only British, with the architecture of earlier colonial regimes, Greek and Roman, is something we completely take for granted. In both visual and architectural terms, colonial is simply a synonym for classical. This in turn is a synonym for the architecture of the European ancient world in Greece and Rome. In the United States, where, like in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or Latin America, the white colonists settled permanently, colonial became a term which, for the hegemonic white majority, had always positive connotations, which is why we see it all over New York State. On the other hand, in India, Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, Africa, and the Caribbean, where the white colonists were driven out or were obliged to leave, colonial, of course, connotes foreign oppression. Let me say something about the institution and the department to which I'd come in Binghamton. The art history department, which I joined, was committed to what was called the new art history of the late 1980s, rapidly replacing connoisseurship with new theoretical and methodological approaches: Marxism, feminism, psychoanalysis, semiotics, deconstruction, postmodernism, and then, after I'd arrived, post-colonialism and globalization. Nonetheless, arriving in Binghamton in January 1988, I met with some unexpected culture shocks. It wasn't to do with moving from England to the United States, as I'd been a graduate student there many, many years before. Nor was it due to moving to an American university, as one university is more or less like any other. The shock came from moving really from one discipline to another, from sociology to art history. I've occasionally described it, with some exaggeration, as something like a sex change. There are many anecdotes I could relate which illustrate this sense of culture shock, but I'll restrict myself to 3. Shortly after I arrived, one of my colleagues introduced me to another professor from comparative literature. "Professor Stanson," he began, "let me introduce our new professor of art history, Anthony King." "Oh, how marvelous," she replied. "What period are you in?" Stunned, I replied after a few seconds, "The present." Some months later, in a graduate seminar, one of the older, wiser students from South Africa suddenly asked, "Who is this one you keep referring to?" Exposing to everyone present, including myself, my inbred social and cultural habit of avoiding reference to myself by using the common English middle-class phrase, "one would have thought that," somehow, of course, in a taken-for-granted assumption of sociological objectivity. You know, you don't want to say it's yours, you want to hand it responsibility over to this one person. I became increasingly aware that some of my art history colleagues invariably began sentences with the personal pronoun I. In England, art history always sounds much more distinguished when referred to by the German Kunstgeschichte. This is a word invested with deep historical and cultural meaning, and indeed why not, given that the very first professor of art history was appointed in Göttingen as long ago as 1813. It's a term with a certain aura or cachet. One day when I was back in England and opening up a new account in Bristol, where we now live, the manager inquired about my occupation. "Professor," I answered. "Of what?" she asked. "Art history." "Oh, how lovely," she responded, doubtless imagining me gazing at impressionist paintings all day. Art history, in other words, has an image problem, but so indeed do many disciplines. Despite its relatively recent transformation, the new art history is still about periods, in one of which I was supposed to be. Art history in the United States, and maybe also in the UK, job descriptions, course titles, publications, is still structured by Western concepts of time, such as medieval, early modern, Baroque, Renaissance. Art history, indeed, most humanities disciplines, has still to come to terms with the temporal and spatial imperatives of an increasingly globalized world. How do we categorize global space and time? If global brings us new realms of space, which provides us what provides us with new concepts of time? Maybe erasing the Roman calendar? I don't know. The solution to these problems of the recategorization of knowledge, as well as other themes, comes as much from the student body and its origins as from the instructor. When I first arrived in Binghamton, virtually all of our graduate students came from one country, the United States, and even one state, New York. This is a difficult, if not impossible, situation if we are critiquing notions about the so-called world system, or trying to adapt categories of analysis to the realities of globalization. The links that I had with the Bredell Center quickly allowed me to change the situation. Courses addressing topics like nations, cultures and cities, or post-colonialism and culture, were transformed by having students from all over the world, from Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Canada, Mexico, China, Turkey, India, Brazil. Students, as we've all discovered, learn as much, if not more, from each other as they do from their instructor. And then in English, because it sounds much nicer and neater in the original. Soziologen sind Leute, die das, was jeder versteht und niemanden interessiert, so formulieren, dass es niemand mehr versteht, aber jeden interessiert. Sociologists are people who take something which everyone understands but no one is interested in and change it into something which no one understands but everyone is interested in. I've often used this definition in graduate classes along with the following true story which illustrates just how theoretically useful sociology can be. One evening, many years ago, I was watching a panel discussion on the box about people's eating habits, about the times and nature of various meals and how they behaved at meal times, breakfast, lunch or dinner, or maybe up here in the north, tea. 3 of the 4 panel members, a nutritionist, a doctor, and a bishop of all people, were all content throughout the discussion to speak about meals. However, the 4th, a sociologist, insisted throughout on referring to structured food events. Yet how better to describe and conceptualize a fairly frequent sight in the morning as my American neighbor left his house, bagel in one hand, steaming plastic coffee cup in the other, somehow open his car door and then drive off to the office. To cite a well-worn saying, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. That, of course, was his breakfast. I've suggested that one university is like another. Well, yes and no. When I first met the dean of the faculty, when I first went there, a professor of English, she closed the meeting by saying, "Well, Tony, we certainly agree on what we're all about here: race, class, ethnicity, and gender." In these liberal and supportive conditions, it was no problem after a year after my arrival in Binghamton to find funding and administrative support to arrange a one-day conference on the theme of Culture, Globalization and the World System, Contemporary Conditions for the Representation of Identity, and then for the proceedings to be published. Through some serendipitous conditions, it was possible to bring together some of the key figures in the globalization debate at that time. Emanuel Wallerstein, of course, was already there to speak about the world system, but also other prominent sociologists, anthropologists, cultural studies scholars to address questions of globalization and culture. Stuart Hall, Roland Robertson, who I've cited a couple of times, Ulf Hannertz, Janet Abu-Lugod, Janet Wolfe, and others. The book of that conference that was published in 1991, one of the first to address the topic of globalization and culture and republished in the second edition in 1997, was subsequently translated into Japanese, Arabic, Spanish, and Turkish. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that conference happening in another space or indeed at another time. I've described in relation to my time at Brunel University how my weekly commuting by train over 13 years added to my understanding of the urban landscape, how it merged London and Leeds and London into one single space. In Binghamton, my commuting back home in England was much less frequent, of course, usually 2 or 3 trips a year over a period of 18 years and over 80 flights across the Atlantic. Yet over the years I became increasingly fascinated by the phenomenon as well as the distinct spaces and indeed faces of flight. Whether airports, aircraft, aircrew or the hemisphere that they flew in. Waiting at airports, I began to speak to aircrew, preferably pilots, discovering, for example, that each day 500 flights took place in each direction across the Atlantic, or that 90 tons of fuel was needed for one place to do this, all stored up in the wings. On one flight from London, I asked and was then happily invited to go up front and sit with the pilot and chat about the flight. Just think of it. At any one time, it seems, there were cityfuls of people flying around in the sky. For the very first time in the history of humankind, 100,000 people might be miles up in the sky at any one moment. What were they doing? What were they thinking? How were they bringing the world together, or indeed plotting to tear it apart? On another occasion, returning to New York from a conference in Paris in 1992, picking up the New York Herald Tribune, I suddenly discovered that we were crossing the Atlantic on October the 14th, exactly 500 years to the day after Columbus had completed a similar trip. As a historian, I got quite excited by this coincidence and via a stewardess sent a message to the captain suggesting he might like to make an announcement over the intercom. He wisely declined, but nevertheless presented me with a personally dedicated and signed copy of the flight plan as a souvenir. As an aid to my researches and as possible illustrations for the next book, I began taking photos on the ground, in the air, from books, anything to do with the wonders, the technologies, and not least the beauties of flight. When I wrote the book, proposal for my last book, Spaces of Global Cultures, about the turn of the millennium, I had a chapter outline called Cities in the Sky, where I intended to explore these and other ideas. No one seemed to be writing about them at that time. But then 9/11 happened, and immediately the media was saturated with everything to do with flying. My intended chapter disappeared. I'm still reflecting whether John Urry's recent book on aeromobilities has ended that ambition, but here are a few selection of some of the images. This is like the one that I came up from Bristol in. They're great big animals, isn't it? That was a low one. This is an interesting one that we could talk about. I'll leave you to guess what it... And this is the scene, not exactly the Native Americans waiting to see Columbus landing on their shores, which is a favorite subject for a picture, as you can imagine, in North America, or used to be, should I say, very quickly. This is not exactly the Native Americans waiting to see Columbus landing on their shores, but the descendants of the millions and millions of colonists who have arrived in North America since 1492. These were the people who were waiting to meet us up the plain on the 14th of October of 1992. I wondered whether any of them realized what the date was. In the Department of Art History at SUNY Binghamton, this is called the conclusion. In the Department of Art History at SUNY Binghamton, we were never short of theories, from Baudrillard to Barre and from Foucault to Freud. Yet the most interesting thing for me to see was how the use of different theoretical frameworks was transformed by empirical research and practice, not least from students from all over the world. Anthropologist James Clifford has spoken of travelling theory. As theories and concepts are transplanted from one part of the world to another, they are invariably translated. Just a month ago, I was given a DVD of a project sponsored by the European Commission and involving academics from 10 universities in Europe and South Asia. It consisted of 10 case studies developed as teaching material, illustrating 300 years of the cultural exchange between Europe and South Asia, which had resulted from their various maritime heritages. Much to my surprise and also delight, one of these case studies was produced by members of the history department at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh, entitled Globalizing the Bengal Hut, which, while drawing fairly extensively on my bungalow book, had portrayed the invention of the bungalow, but from a Bangladesh perspective, which I thought was a nice, charming idea. In conclusion, I hope I've been able to illustrate something of Lefebvre's idea of space as directly lived, and how the opportunities offered by these different spaces, the cities, the institutions where we work, the disciplines, the students, and especially not forgetting the happy accidents, how they all contribute to the creation of new knowledge as well as new identities. Today, the internet acts in some ways like a virtual city, a substitute for the kind of institutional, international space that I've been discussing. Some years ago, my friend Tom Marcus, who many of you must know, author of the award-winning book entitled Buildings and Power, Tom and I decided that we would make use of our various experiences to start a new series of books on the kind of interdisciplinary research on architecture, urbanism and the city that we would like to promote. Research no longer connected to any single city or single country, institution, or even discipline. The idea of the Architects series is not only bring together recent debates in social and cultural theory and the study of architecture, building and urbanism, but one that aims to do so within their larger global and post-colonial context. And I brought along a few flyers here for people who might be interested in looking at it. Speaking here in Newcastle, the football capital of the North, there seems no better way of ending this talk than shamelessly stating that the most recent title in the series, edited by sociologists Sybil Frank and Silke Streets, is called Stadium Worlds, Football, Space and the Built Environment. In their summarizing essay, the two editors conclude by referring to the intriguing concept of an architecture of mass assembly. This is a conceptual framework which allows them to draw comparisons between the stadium and the cathedral, and especially the nature and the direction of the mass gaze that is characteristic of each. But what they say here, as I'm afraid I've run out of time, I shall have to leave you to discover. Thank you for your attention.